Hello everyone, this is Mr. O'Brien and welcome to the video quiz for the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. So let's get started. Washington's headaches. Only about 33% of the colonists were in favor of a war for independence. The other third were loyalists, loyal to Britain, and the final third were neutral. Didn't care who controlled the wealth and power in the colonies. It wasn't going to be them anyway. Congress couldn't tax to raise money for the Continental Army. Was another headache for Washington, especially under the Articles, because remember, the Articles of Confederation came to be in 1781 during the Revolutionary War. And poor training for the soldiers. And you see Georgie down there in the bottom right. Alright, I'm reading from the notes underneath the slide. The American Revolution created a distinctive definition of national identity, resting on freedom. From its beginning, the notion of, quote, American exceptionalism, city upon a hill, the belief that the United States has a special mission to be a refuge from tyranny, a symbol of freedom, and a model for the rest of the world, has been central to American nationality and nationalism. Still is. Paine and others believed that the American Revolution was an event of global historical importance, with the power to reshape the world. And it did have large effects globally. Without the burden of monarchy, aristocracy, and hereditary privilege of the old world of Europe, America would be a new nation governed by principles of universal freedom, freedom for all. Although George Washington at first would not accept black recruits, contradictions, in the Continental Army, he reversed his policy after a British proclamation offered freedom to Virginia slaves who escaped and served in the British military. Again, Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Around 5,000 blacks enlisted in the American Army and militia, some of whom were slaves, promised their freedom if they served as subs for their master or his son. So again, this meant that the Continental soldier tended to be less elite, more of a commoner, a middling folk, since the elite could just put a slave in there as a sub. Indeed, blacks fighting under George Washington served in racially integrated units, the last black Americans to do so in regular units until the Korean War in the early 1950s. Indeed, Rhode Island, which had heavy involvement in the slave trade, and with a large black population, formed a black regiment. Moreover, blacks and whites served together in racially integrated Continental Army units. It should be noted that more blacks fought with the British than the Continental Army, as that avenue offered slaves a greater opportunity or greater chance of freedom. Except for South Carolina and Georgia, the southern colonies also enrolled free blacks and slaves to fight. While these colonies did not explicitly promise the slaves their freedom, many received it individually once the war concluded, at which time Virginia emancipated slaves who had served in the American Army. Moving on, we get to the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 1775. Where the British suffered over 40% casualties. So I'm reading from the notes underneath. This was the first major battle of the Revolutionary War. Alright, the notes. When the war began, England enjoyed the following advantages, and remember this. Number 1, they had the world's best navy. Number 2, they had a professionally trained army. Number 3, they were able to recruit Hessians or German mercenaries to fight with them. And they also were able to lure slaves to fight on their side, via Lord Dunmore's proclamation. And England's colonies in the West Indies down in the Caribbean, fearful of a slave revolt, remained loyal during the war, and that provided them with a strategic location close to the American colonies. Okay? Alright, so after the Battle of Bunker Hill, we get to New York City. The British take over New York City, 1776. You see the city burning down. Remember, all things were made of wood back then. Alright. As you can tell, I love my military history. Surprise attack on Christmas night, 1776. You see George Washington crossing the Delaware. And two things. First, this painting is huge. It's the size of a wall. Second thing, he probably was not really standing like that as he was crossing the Delaware. Probably would have fallen out of the boat if he tried to stand like that. All right. But you can see the imagery, kind of the nimbus, the heavenly rays coming off of the flag, Washington standing, very regal. kind of like the landing of Columbus painting we viewed. Okay, so this is a very famous painting by Emanuel Lutz, 1851, Washington crossing the Delaware. All right, now we get to the Battle of Saratoga, perhaps one of the most important, actually it is one of the most important battles of the Revolutionary War. It was a huge turning point. It was after this battle the French finally thought the U.S. could win, the colonies could win, and agreed to support the colonies in the war against Britain. So in October 1777, a second British army advancing south from Canada into New York intended to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. It was surrounded and defeated and forced to surrender at Saratoga in upstate New York. While the British Army remained quartered in New York, American troops suffered a punishing winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. But the victory at Saratoga helped persuade the French in 1778 to recognize the United States and supply it with military assistance. Spain soon joined the war on the American side as well, and we got loans from the Dutch. Though these allies first limited their attacks, the entry of France into the war in particular forced Britain to defend not only America but much of its global empire. So the war was being fought outside the 13 colonies, and significantly weakened its capacity to wage war in North America, in the colonies. So now we get to the Battle of Yorktown. All right, I'm reading from the notes underneath here. Yorktown's in Virginia. Finally, in 1781, defeats and costly campaigns weakened the British forces there, commanded by Lord Cornwallis, who moved his army to Yorktown, located on a Virginia peninsula. Washington rushed his forces there, and with French troops laid a siege, which, when supported by a French naval blockade, forced Cornwallis to surrender his army there in October 1781. So Cornwallis did not have a land or a water escape route. The imperial rivalry between Europe's great colonial powers had helped create the American colonies, and now it secured their independence as a new nation. That is to say, negotiation of the Treaty of Paris began after this defeat and was finally signed a couple of years later. All right, so this is a famous painting of the surrender by John Trumbull, of the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown, and the world was turned upside down. The ragtag Continental Army had defeated the biggest, baddest military in the world. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what role women played in the Revolutionary War. Reading from the notes underneath here. Women contributed to the struggle for national independence. At least one woman disguised herself as a man, enlisted in the Continental Army, and fought in several battles. And her name was not Molly Pitcher. She's a fictional character. Other patriot women protested merchants charging high prices, made homespun goods for the army, or passed information about the British to the rebel army, so they were also spies. Other women formed ladies' associations to raise funds for American soldiers. The conflict pulled women into private and sometimes, gasp, public political discussion. Most famously, Abigail Adams admonished her husband John Adams to, quote, "remember the ladies," when establishing government and rights in the new nation, and he promptly didn't. Nevertheless, gender remained an important boundary of freedom in America. Independence did not change the family law inherited from Britain. Husbands still held legal authority over the body, property, and choices of their wives, while political freedom for men meant the right to self-government and consent over the political arrangements that ruled over them. For women, the marriage contract was more important than the social contract. Women's relationship to the society was mediated through her relationship to her husband. Think how women take the man's last name. Women lacked the essential basis of political participation. Autonomy, or control over oneself, founded on property ownership or control over one's person. So, since land ownership equated to true independence, and women did not or were not allowed to own land for the most part after they got married, put two and two together, they were not truly free, legally speaking. Most men considered women naturally submissive and irrational, emotional, controlled by their emotions more than their intellect, and therefore unfit for citizenship. We'll read a document in class about John Adams and why he thought that. Public debate in the Revolutionary era saw men's rights as natural entitlements, as natural-born Englishmen. Women's role was viewed in terms of duty and obligations, and their rights flowed from their roles as wives and mothers. By definition, the Republican citizen was male. Yet, the revolution did improve the status of many women. The ideology of Republican motherhood, produced by the revolution, gave women the responsibility to train future citizens. This is very, very important. Revolutionary leaders believed that the nation's morality would be developed by women within the household and family. While it ruled out women's direct participation in politics, Republican motherhood did encourage the expansion of women's educational opportunities. They had to be smart to teach their children good Republican values. It also strengthened the emerging ideal of companionate marriage, in which marriages were cemented by affection and mutual dependency rather than male authority. So marry for love rather than for other reasons. The revolution also changed family structure. While slaves, as dependents on the male head of household, remained part of the owner's, quote, family, in the North, hired wage workers replaced indentured servants and apprentices who had once been considered family members, not seen as part of the household. Alright, so final slide. Right here you see a map of North America after the war. The British still controlled Canada up here. Alright, Spain still controlled Louisiana, the Louisiana Territory. It will fall back into French hands eventually, soon, but not yet. And Spain still controls Florida and the Mississippi River down here, and also modern-day Mexico. So, until independence, the 13 colonies in North America had only been part of Britain's empire in the Western Hemisphere. In Canada and the West Indies, where planters feared slave revolts, colonists refused Americans' appeal to join the war against the mother country, as I mentioned earlier. But with the Treaty of Paris, the United States of America became the first independent nation in the hemisphere, reflecting in its boundaries not the unity of a region, but the circumstances of its birth. So the Treaty of Paris did 4 things. Number 1, it recognized American independence. It maintained, number 2, the alliance between the U.S. and France. It didn't sever. Number 3, and that's important, it comes back. Number 3, it gave the U.S. territory between Canada and Florida east of the Mississippi River, and the Indians were once again conquered peoples. And it required the restoration by the U.S. of Loyalist property seized by local and state governments during the war, which became a controversial thing because the states had to collect taxes to pay back the property of Loyalists, so it became a very contentious thing in the states after the treaty. All right, that's it.